At 11:47 in the morning on January 11, 1944, Major James Howard looked across the sky above Aschersleben, Germany, and saw more than 30 German fighters dropping toward 3 tight groups of B-17 flying fortresses. His own squadron of P-51 Mustangs had scattered after a brief and violent dogfight, and he suddenly realized he was alone at 24,000 feet with no wingman anywhere in sight. Howard was 30 years old and already a veteran with 70 missions behind him. He had flown 56 combat sorties over Burma and China, with the Flying Tigers where he had shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. Then he had taken command of the 356th Fighter Squadron in Europe in December and flown 14 more missions in the new long-range P-51B Mustang. Now he faced some of the most experienced Luftwaffe pilots in Germany. The approaching enemy fighters were Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s flying from bases less than 50 miles away with full fuel and fresh ammunition. The mission had begun at 0700 that morning when 50 Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group joined 3 major divisions of B-17 bombers, heading toward German aircraft factories in Aschersleben and Halberstadt. These factories were essential to the German war machine, and destroying them meant slowing down enemy fighter production. The heavy bombers completed their runs, dropped their bombs, and turned to head back toward England. That was when the Luftwaffe struck. Howard and his group had been drawn into a fight earlier with twin-engine Bf-110 fighters near the target. Howard managed to destroy one cleanly, but the engagement scattered his formation. When he climbed back up to rejoin the bombers, he discovered that not a single friendly fighter remained. Every other Mustang had been pulled away by the confusion of battle. The earlier P-47 Thunderbolt escorts had already turned back an hour before because they lacked the fuel to travel deeper into Germany. That left Howard as the only fighter pilot protecting 300 men spread across 10 B-17 bombers, all locked into the rigid formation they needed to survive the long return flight home. His P-51 carried 450 caliber Browning machine guns, 2 in each wing, with a total of 1,700 rounds. The inboard guns held 350 rounds each, and the outboard guns held 280. That meant roughly 4 minutes of continuous fire if he handled the trigger with perfect discipline. His fuel gauges showed he had only about 30 minutes of combat time remaining before he would face the possibility of gliding over hostile territory. The first wave of German fighters lined up for an attack. Howard shoved his throttle forward into emergency power and dove to meet them. His Mustang rushed past 400 miles per hour as he closed on a Bf-109, preparing to hit a B-17 named Patches. Howard centered his gun sight and fired a 3-second burst, sending 75 rounds into the German fighter. The canopy shattered and the enemy aircraft flipped over trailing smoke before spiraling downward out of the fight. Howard immediately pulled into a hard 6G turn that squeezed the edges of his vision into a tunnel. 2 more Bf-109s were already setting up for another run at the bombers. He reversed his turn, cut inside their radius, and used the Mustang's fast roll rate to get behind the trailing fighter. He squeezed off a 1-second burst and its engine erupted in flame. The pilot bailed out, quickly leaving his aircraft to fall. But more enemy fighters were coming. FW-190s with yellow noses identifying them as part of an elite unit closed in from the north. They spotted Howard instantly, one American fighter alone protecting the bombers. They knew they could overwhelm him with organized attacks. Howard checked his ammunition. He had already burned through 500 rounds in less than 4 minutes. That left about 1,200 rounds. The German pilots certainly understood these numbers as well. They would press their advantage and wait for his guns to run dry. Howard watched the enemy begin to coordinate. Some fighters would draw him away, while others targeted the bombers directly. He had seconds to decide whether he should fight for his own survival in a turning battle, or stay rooted to the bombers and accept the risk of being hit from any direction. He chose the bombers, a Focke-Wulf Dove at the lead formation from high 12 o'clock. Howard cut the angle and fired. The German fighter's wing root exploded, and the aircraft snapped into a violent left roll before breaking apart. 2 more enemy fighters then attacked from opposite sides. Howard's ammunition count kept dropping, and his fuel situation was worsening. Already, he had used up a significant portion of both. The German fighters kept coming wave after wave, and Howard understood this would not be a short fight. It would last until he was shot down, ran out of bullets, or the bombers were destroyed. But he held his position alone above Germany, determined to protect the 300 men depending on him, as the sky filled with enemy aircraft closing in from every direction. Howard pushed his Mustang harder as he dropped into a steep dive that sent his airspeed climbing past 430 miles per hour. The vertical drop built momentum, and at the bottom of the dive, he pulled the aircraft up into a spiraling climb that forced 3 Bf-109s to follow him upward. At the top of the loop, he reversed sharply. The German fighter's shot passed his nose, unable to match the sudden maneuver. Howard rolled inverted, pulled the Mustang through the arc, and slipped behind the trailing enemy fighter. He squeezed the trigger for a 2-second burst, and another German machine burst into flame before tumbling through the sky. Then his gun camera caught something wrong. 3 of his 4 Browning machine guns had suddenly stopped firing. Only his left inboard gun was still functioning. The pounding G-forces and the freezing temperatures at 24,000 feet had jammed the other guns. Springs contracted belts stiffened metal, twisted in the cold. He had no time to fix anything. He was down to 1 gun and roughly 350 rounds, which meant less than 90 seconds of total firing time if he was careful. The German pilots did not know about his malfunction, and that ignorance was the only advantage he had left. Howard kept moving aggressively. If the enemy believed he still had 4 guns, they would respect the threat and approach more cautiously, which meant fewer clean shots at the bombers. A Focke-Wulf swooped down from the right, aiming for a B-17 at the back of the formation. Howard banked hard into the attack, lined up his shot at 400 yards, and fired a short burst. The German pilot immediately abandoned the attack and dove out of the fight. Howard had no idea whether his bullets had struck the aircraft. It did not matter. He had saved the bomber for another half-minute, and that was what mattered. 2 more Bf-109s then came in from opposite sides in a classic pincer strike, designed to overwhelm a lone defender. Howard could only engage one of them. He chose the closer threat and turned toward it. The German broke away early. The second fighter continued its approach, but when Howard reversed suddenly to face it, that pilot also broke off. Not a single enemy aircraft managed a clean shot at the bombers. Howard was using movement and presence to compensate for what his weapons could no longer provide. In the B-17 formations, gunners watched the solitary Mustang slash back and forth between attacking fighters. They saw German aircraft coming from everywhere. They saw Howard diving, climbing, rolling into threat after threat alone. Some gunners later said they counted 40 enemy fighters in the sky, though most agreed the number was around 30. Every bomber crewman shared the same thought. They were witnessing something they had never seen before, a single fighter escort refusing to leave them despite impossible odds. Howard checked his fuel again. It was sliding toward the yellow range. He had been fighting for 17 minutes. 30 German fighters were still in the area. His 1 remaining gun showed 200 rounds left, perhaps 5 seconds of total firing. The situation had grown far worse. 3 Bf-109s formed into a tight arrowhead and headed straight for the lead bomber. Howard dove to intercept, angling perfectly for a shot. The Germans saw him coming and broke formation, too early, ruining their coordinated attack. They were still assuming he retained full firepower, and that assumption kept them cautious. But Howard knew this bluff would not last forever. A Focke-Wulf then attacked from the right. Howard swung into the threat, pulling 7 GS until his vision narrowed. He fired a 1-second burst. The enemy canopy shattered, and the fighter peeled away wounded but not destroyed. That shot had cost him another 24 rounds. His remaining ammunition dropped to around 175 rounds, less than 5 seconds of firing. The Luftwaffe pilots were adjusting. They began testing him staying on his tail, trying to drag him into defensive spirals. 2 Bf-109s stalked him, keeping him busy and forcing him away from the bomber formation. If they pinned him down, the other German fighters could tear into the B-17s freely. Howard reversed violently and forced the lead German fighter to overshoot. He lined up his nose for a counter shot, pulled the trigger, and heard nothing. No recoil, no vibration, no rounds. His last functioning gun had jammed. He was now alone above Germany with no ammunition at all. The worst moment of the battle arrived in silence. His finger squeezed the trigger again, but the jammed mechanism could not cycle. The remaining rounds sat uselessly in a frozen belt, but the German fighters behind him did not know this. They still believed this Mustang had teeth. When Howard pointed his nose at them, both enemy fighters broke away quickly. That reaction gave him an idea. They could not see his cockpit. They could not see his dead guns. They only saw what he made them see. If he flew like a man with full ammunition, they would act like men facing a loaded threat. He had no bullets left, but he still had maneuvering. He still had presence. If he could bluff convincingly, he could buy the bombers seconds and minutes, which mattered more than anything else now. A Focke-Wulf lined up an attack on a bomber. Howard charged toward it, nose pointed directly at the attacker. The German pilot immediately abandoned his run. Howard repeated this against every fighter that positioned for a strike. Some Germans dove away. Others turned aside. All hesitated when the Mustang rushed toward them. The bombers were being protected by nothing more than Howard's movement and the memory of his initial accurate shooting. But every bluff cost him fuel and altitude. Every hard turn pushed his engine further, and the Luftwaffe pilots were beginning to suspect something was off. Howard's fuel dropped into the red zone. He had around 13 minutes of flight left before he would be gliding. The bombers were still deep in Germany, far from safety, and the number of enemy fighters had not decreased. The next stage of the battle would decide everything. Howard held the trigger down, but his Mustang remained silent. His final gun had jammed completely. The ammunition counter still showed 175 rounds, but it made no difference. The charging mechanism was frozen, or the belt was twisted, or the barrel had overheated even in the brutal cold at 24,000 feet. Whatever the cause, Howard now faced 30 German fighters with absolutely no functioning weapons. The 2 Bf-109s that had been chasing him did not realize his guns were dead. When Howard pointed his nose toward them, they instinctively broke away. That single moment gave Howard his next idea. If the enemy still believed he could fire, they would hesitate, and hesitation meant survival for the bombers. A Focke-Wulf positioned for a clean attack on a bomber flying on the left side of the formation. Howard dove at it, aggressively lining up, as if he were about to fire a full burst. The German pilot panicked and broke away without releasing a single round. Howard had not fired because he could not fire. Yet the threat alone had been enough. He continued using the tactic. Every time a German fighter turned toward the bombers, Howard threw his Mustang directly into their path. The enemy pilots saw the Mustang closing head-on, and they reacted without thinking. They banked away, reverse direction, or dove out of the fight entirely. Howard was now shielding 300 bomber crewmen, using nothing but skill, intimidation, and the memory of the shots he had fired earlier in the battle. But the tactic was draining his remaining resources at a terrifying rate. Every sharp maneuver required full throttle. Every turn bled precious fuel. His gauge crept lower until it reached the very bottom of the red zone. He estimated he had around 8 minutes of combat endurance left. After that, he would become a glider drifting over enemy territory. The German pilots were starting to notice something strange. Howard was diving at them aggressively, but not a single tracer came from his wings. He was pointing his nose but not firing. Three Bf-109s coordinated a simultaneous attack from different approach angles. Howard chose the closest one and intercepted it. The German broke away early, but the other two pressed deeper than before. One got within firing distance of a B-17 named Lucky Lady. The waist gunners inside Lucky Lady opened fire, sending arcs of 50 caliber tracers into the sky. The German attack was wild and inaccurate. He broke away before scoring a hit, but Howard recognized the danger instantly. His bluff was weakening, the enemy was learning, his fuel dropped further. Now he had only 6 minutes left. 6 minutes to protect bombers that were still 90 miles from the German border and more than 170 miles from the safety of Allied fighters over Belgium. The Luftwaffe fighters were not in a hurry. They had plenty of fuel and plenty of ammunition. They knew Howard could not last forever. A Focke-Wulf made another probing approach. Howard pointed his nose and charged in his usual aggressive style. The German turned away as expected, but instead of diving off, he circled back upward almost immediately. He was testing Howard, trying to determine if the Mustang could actually shoot or if the American was bluffing. Two more Bf-109s attacked from different quadrants. Howard intercepted one. The pilot broke away quickly. He reversed and went after the second attacker. This time the German held his course longer, pushing the attack until he was only 300 yards from the bomber before finally pulling off. The enemy was getting bold. Inside the bombers, pilots and gunners felt the tension rising. They had been flying more than 4 hours already. Their engines were burning fuel faster than planned because they had fought headwinds all morning. None of them could break formation. If a bomber left the formation, it would be torn apart by the German fighters. They relied entirely on their box formation and on the lone Mustang that had been holding off the Luftwaffe for more than 20 minutes. Howard looked at his position carefully. The bomber formation was 70 miles from the German border. That meant around 20 minutes of flying, but his fuel gauge showed he had 4 minutes of combat speed left. 4 minutes before his engine quit. The math was merciless. He pressed on anyway. He saw a Bf-109 diving in from above and turned toward it. The German pilot saw the Mustang approaching head-on and rolled away without firing. But Howard's speed dropped dangerously low during the climb. His airspeed indicator fell below 200 miles per hour, and the Mustang trembled under the threat of a stall. He lowered the nose to recover speed, which cost him altitude and time. The enemy fighters continued probing, coordinating using decoys to split Howard's attention. A Focke-Wulf made a feint from the right. Howard turned toward it. It broke away quickly, but while Howard was occupied, two Bf-109s on the left rushed in at the bombers. He swung back left, and both Germans broke off again, but they came much closer than before, one closing to within 200 yards of a B-17's tail. Howard's fuel dropped to 3 minutes. 3 minutes until his Merlin engine would starve. 30 enemy fighters still circled them, and the bombers still had 70 miles of hostile sky to cross, but Howard refused to leave. More enemy fighters lined up. Two Focke-Wulfs launched a simultaneous attack. Howard moved directly at the leader. For the first time, the German did not break immediately. He held his approach. Howard held his. They closed together until both pilots broke away almost simultaneously at less than 300 yards. It was clear now that the German pilots were no longer convinced of Howard's firepower. A Bf-109 then approached from below using a belly attack where bomber gunners had limited vision. Howard rolled inverted, pinned himself against his harness, and dove to drive it away. The German immediately rolled off and dropped out of gun range. Howard pulled back up to the formation. The maneuver cost more fuel. His gauge showed less than 2 minutes left. Then the Germans scored their first hit. 3 Bf-109s positioned again, one high, one level, one low, all converging on the same B-17. Howard went after the high fighter and forced it away, but the others pressed in. The level attacker approached within 150 yards before turning off. The low attacker fired a burst. Tracers cut through the air and several struck the bomber's right wing. Flames did not erupt and the bomber held formation, but the hit proved the Luftwaffe was adapting. Howard's bluff was unraveling. His fuel slid under the 2-minute mark. The bombers were 60 miles from the border. The Germans could sense the momentum shifting. 6 fighters formed into 2 tight V formations, preparing a coordinated strike. Howard watched them gathering and understood that the next minutes would decide the fate of everyone in the sky. Howard understood his situation completely. He had no ammunition, no wingmen, no support, and almost no fuel. But he also knew the 300 men inside the B-17 formation had no one else to rely on. He could see the next wave of German fighters building up for another coordinated attack, and he knew that if he chose to leave now, the Luftwaffe would fall on the bombers without hesitation. The mission would end in disaster, so he made the only decision that ever made sense to him. He would stay with the bombers until his fuel ran out or until he was killed. There was no middle ground. His Mustang roared as he kept it pressed as hard as the engine would allow. A Bf-109 dove from above. Howard angled his nose up at nearly 70 degrees, forcing his aircraft into a long climbing turn that pushed his body deep into the seat. The German pilot saw the Mustang coming directly at him and peeled away without firing. Another attack defeated, but the maneuver cost Howard dearly. His airspeed bled down below 200 miles per hour. The Mustang began to shake near stall, and he had to dip the nose to regain speed, losing altitude in the process. The Luftwaffe pilots were watching these things closely. They were sensing weakness. A Focke-Wulf darted in from the right in a feint. Howard turned into it. The German broke off at once. But while Howard was focused on that movement, 2 Bf-109s swept in from the left, heading for the bombers. Howard reversed immediately. His Mustang rolled with its usual sharp authority, and he cut off both attackers. They broke away, but they pushed closer than before, almost within striking distance. The bomber crews could feel the shift too. Every man in every B-17 knew the German pilots were getting bolder. Howard glanced again at his fuel gauge. It hovered at around 3 minutes left and dropping. He could almost feel time draining away with every breath. Still, he stayed locked onto the formation. 2 Focke-Wulfs launched another combined attack. Howard went after the leader. This time the German held longer before breaking. Only at less than 300 yards did both fighters peel away from the Mustang. The boldness of the German flight confirmed Howard's fear. His bluff was wearing thin. A Bf-109 then approached from below using the blind angle where bomber gunners struggled to get a clean shot. Howard rolled upside down and dropped through the sky, chasing the German out of position. The dive put tremendous strain on his airframe and ate more fuel, but he forced the enemy away again. He climbed back up toward the bombers, feeling the first real bites of desperation as his fuel needle flickered. He was now at roughly 2 minutes of full power flight. Below him, roads, forests, and fields rolled past in perfect clarity, cold and hostile. All of it was German territory. If his engine died now, he would have to bail out where German civilians and soldiers waited below. He knew what often happened to downed Allied airmen, especially those whose bomber groups had struck German cities. A pilot might survive the bailout only to be beaten or killed on the ground. Howard pushed the fear out of mind. It had no place here. Then came a coordinated triple attack from 3 Bf-109s. One came from high, one from level, one from low. All 3 converged on the same B-17. Howard could not reach all of them. He chose the high threat, closing on it until the German broke hard, but the other 2 had already pressed their chances. One of them came within 150 yards of a bomber named Texas Rose before peeling away. The low attacker came closer, still firing a burst that sent lines of glowing tracers ripping through the air. A few struck the bomber's right wing. The crew inside Texas Rose braced, but the aircraft did not catch fire and did not fall out of formation. Still, the hit signaled a change in the battle. The Luftwaffe pilots had proven they could inflict damage even with Howard there, and that small victory emboldened them. Howard felt the shift instantly. His fuel gauge dipped toward the final minutes of life his Mustang had left. The bombers were 60 miles from the German border. 15 minutes of flight for them, but Howard did not have 15 minutes. He did not have 10, he had maybe 1 or 2, and the Germans understood it too. Their movements became more coordinated, more deliberate. 6 fighters joined into 2 V formations, preparing to attack from both sides at once. Howard studied the geometry quickly. He knew he could not block both formations, but he could try to disrupt one enough to throw off their timing. He turned toward the first V of BF-109s and accelerated. The German pilots kept their line. They did not break. Howard kept coming closer, 400 yards, then 300, then 250. Still they held course. Only at 200 yards did the formation suddenly scatter, breaking apart and losing their coordinated position. While Howard forced the first group to break their attack, the second formation of German fighters was already descending on the bombers from the other side. Howard reversed instantly, pushing into a brutal 7G turn that pressed darkness into the edges of his vision. He fought through the strain, pointed his nose toward the second attack, but he was too far and too slow to fully intercept. 3 Focke-Wulfs came in high at 12 o'clock above a B-17. The bomber's top turret fired streams of 50 caliber tracers upward toward them. But the German fighters pressed through, returning fire with 20mm cannons. 1 Focke-Wulf took multiple hits and fell away trailing smoke, but the other 2 scored direct hits on the bomber. Howard saw impacts walking across its fuselage. 1 engine began trailing black smoke, but the propeller still spun. The bomber remained in formation, though badly wounded. Howard's fuel gauge showed around 90 seconds of life remaining. He could leave now and maybe glide far enough toward Belgium to bail out safely. Or he could accept that he might die here and continue to shield the bombers until his Mustang fell from the sky. Howard never hesitated. He stayed. His decision removed all other concerns. No more calculations, no more escape routes. He would fight until his engine died. 4 BF-109s then attacked from below. Howard flipped inverted, dropped onto them, and scattered their attack. 2 turned left to right. Howard climbed again, though his fuel was nearly gone. One of the damaged B-17s began losing airspeed. Its number 3 engine smoked heavily. The bomber dropped behind the formation, becoming an isolated target. The Luftwaffe saw it instantly. 3 Focke-Wulfs turned toward it like predators sensing wounded prey. Howard followed. He moved between the bomber and the attackers, turning himself into the last barrier, the last hope. The lead German fighter charged head-on, refusing to yield. Howard held steady too. At 400 miles per hour, they rushed toward each other, closing at 800 miles per hour. 6 seconds. 5, 4, 3. At the last moment, the German pilot broke away. Howard had forced him off, but the other 2 Germans used the distraction to rake the bomber with fire. Its number 3 engine erupted in flames, and the B-17 slipped even farther behind. Howard swung back toward the bomber, placing himself once more between the wounded crew and the circling predators. His fuel gauge showed 30 seconds remaining. His Merlin engine coughed. The final stage of the battle had begun. Howard felt the engine shudder as the fuel sloshed in nearly empty tanks. Every second mattered now. His Mustang was running on fumes while the wounded B-17 behind him fell farther from the main formation, losing both speed and altitude. Its number 3 engine was out, and the damage from the earlier German attack had taken a toll on its performance. It could no longer keep pace. The Luftwaffe pilots recognized the opportunity with predatory precision. 5 BF-109s began circling the crippled bomber like wolves around a weakening animal. Howard knew exactly what they intended. Once separated from the protective box formation, the wounded bomber would stand no chance. It would be shot apart in seconds unless he remained between it and the enemy, but his engine was failing. His gauges sat nearly flat. He had no ammunition. He had only maneuvering skill and raw determination, and even those were fading with his Mustang losing power. A lead German fighter dove first at the damaged B-17. Howard threw his aircraft between them nose, pointed directly at the attacker. His engine coughed, loudly bucked, and then steadied for a brief moment. That moment was enough. The Bf-109 pilot broke away instantly. The second German fighter made a pass from the opposite angle. Howard reversed in a hard roll, his Mustang still nimble even as it gasped for fuel. He turned sharply enough to threaten the second attacker, who also chose to break away rather than gamble on whether the Mustang could still fire. But 3 more enemy fighters continued to maneuver for an opening. They had heard the sound of his failing engine. They could see his weakening airspeed. They knew his power was dying, and that sooner or later he would be unable to defend the bomber. Howard could feel his altitude slipping too. Without full engine power, he was descending at a slow but steady rate, perhaps 200 feet per minute. If the engine quit entirely, he would be in a powerless glide with only 4 minutes of flight left before he would have to bail out over German territory. Ahead of him, the main bomber formation was about 5 miles away, still heading toward the German border. They had about 45 more miles of danger left. Behind him, the wounded B-17 struggled to hold altitude now around 21,000 feet. The crew was dumping everything they could out of the aircraft: ammunition, boxes, empty cases, equipment, anything that had weight. Howard saw crates tumbling from the open bomb bay doors. They were trying desperately to lighten the aircraft enough to stay airborne. The Luftwaffe pilots continued probing. 2 Bf-109s came in from opposite angles in a classic pincer attack. Howard turned toward one, but in that moment his engine died completely. The propeller stopped. All sound vanished except for the whistle of cold air rushing past the canopy. His Mustang had become a glider. The German pilot, coming in closest, saw the dead propeller instantly. He pressed his attack, getting closer to the bomber, lining up his shot. Howard dipped the Mustang's nose steeply to maintain airspeed and turned aggressively toward the attacker. Even without power, his aircraft responded thanks to the speed he still carried. The German hesitated, then broke off. Howard's threat meant more to them than the reality of his empty guns, but the silence inside the cockpit was terrifying. His altimeter spun downward, 20,000 feet, 19,000, 18,000. He was descending faster now and losing the ability to turn sharply. Without power, the Mustang's control authority weakened with each passing second. The Luftwaffe pilots saw that too. 4 enemy fighters regrouped into a tight attack formation, focusing entirely on the wounded bomber. Howard forced his powerless Mustang into a climbing arc to place himself in their path, but the angle was shallow, the effort strained his diminishing airspeed, and the Germans closed in. Then Howard saw something in the distance. Small dark specks far to the west approaching fast. At first he could not tell what they were. His heart pounded. Could these be more German fighters adding to the onslaught? But then the shapes grew larger and clearer. 8 P-47 Thunderbolts were racing toward them, climbing to intercept. The relief escorts had finally arrived. They were still several minutes away, but their presence changed everything. The Luftwaffe pilots noticed them too. They understood instantly that they were seconds from losing their numerical advantage. The 4 German fighters preparing to attack the wounded bomber broke formation at once and turned east. The others in the area scattered as well, each pilot choosing survival over pressing the attack now that fresh American fighters were on the way. Within moments, the sky that had been filled with enemy aircraft became suddenly empty. The 30-minute battle was over. The bombers were safe, but Howard was not. His Mustang was gliding downward through 17,000 feet with no power and only the thin hope of reaching friendly lines. The P-47 flight leader called over the radio asking for his status. Howard explained calmly that he was out of fuel and attempting to glide toward Belgium. He kept his Mustang steady, conserving as much altitude as possible. The Thunderbolt pilots formed a protective ring around him, guiding him westward. As he descended through 15,000 feet, then 12,000, then 10,000. Far below he could make out the frozen landscape of Belgium, but even from 10,000 feet he knew he did not have enough altitude to reach the safety of an Allied airfield. At his current glide ratio, he could travel about 10 miles horizontally for every 1,000 feet lost. That gave him roughly 19 miles of range. The Belgian border was about 22 miles away. He would fall short unless he could coax a few more seconds of life from the empty Merlin engine. Howard switched to the auxiliary tank, turned the fuel pump to emergency, high-set the mixture to rich, cracked the throttle, and hit the starter. The propeller turned once, twice, and then the engine coughed to life, sputtering weakly. It ran for 3 seconds, then died again, but those 3 seconds leveled his descent slightly and bought him distance. He tried again. The engine caught for 5 seconds, then quit, but again those seconds had meaning. They gave him just enough altitude to continue west. The German border slipped behind. The Belgian landscape opened beneath his wings. He was over friendly territory now, but he was still gliding and still far from any runway. He needed the engine to give him just a little more. He tried one last time. The propeller spun slowly. The engine turned over, coughed, ignited, and settled into a rough, uneven idle. It had found some vapor or residue deep in the fuel lines. It was weak, but it was power. Howard leveled at 8,000 feet and kept drifting west, hoping the engine would hold long enough to reach a landing field. The wounded B-17 was descending too now on only 2 working engines. Both aircraft were fighting their final battles not against enemy fighters, but against gravity, time, and distance. Howard's engine sputtered once more and then died for the final time. He was at 7,000 feet, still too far from any major airfield. But ahead he saw something that offered a chance. A small Allied emergency strip lay 15 miles ahead. If his glide path held steady, he might make it. If not, he would crash land in a Belgian field. With nothing but wind carrying him forward, Howard fixed his eyes on the distant runway as the earth slowly rose toward him. Howard kept his powerless Mustang pointed toward the distant emergency airstrip as the wind rushed past the canopy in a steady hollow roar. At 7,000 feet, he still had altitude, but not enough to waste. The runway lay about 15 miles ahead, and every second of descent narrowed the margin between survival and disaster. His engine was silent, now fully dead, with no chance of restarting. The earlier bursts of life from the fuel lines had been the last drops of vapor. The Packard Merlin had nothing left to burn. Ahead of him, the wounded B-17 continued its slow fall through the cold air. It had lost a second engine during the retreat. The crew had shut down number 4, which had been overheating dangerously. The bomber flew on only 2 engines now, and even those strained under the weight of the aircraft. The crew inside had prepared for the worst. They were throwing out everything that was not bolted down: oxygen bottles, ammunition cases, loose equipment, anything to lighten the plane enough to delay the inevitable drop. Howard saw more objects tumble into the sky behind the bomber like dark stones falling through sunlight. Farther east, the Luftwaffe fighters had fully disengaged once the P-47 flight had appeared. They were gone now, climbing back toward their bases to land, refuel, and prepare for another mission. The sky that had moments before echoed with cannon fire and exploding engines was quiet, but the danger had not passed. Howard had fought the Germans without ammunition. He had held the formation together without fuel. But now his fight was with gravity and distance in a nearly silent cockpit over unfamiliar territory. His altimeter needle dropped slowly as he glided. 6,500, 6,000, 5,500. He reviewed his situation. He could not overshoot the runway because he had no power to circle back. He could not come in low because without thrust he would fall short. He needed to hit the approach perfectly and maintain his glide speed at 175 miles per hour, the ideal balance between lift and descent. Too slow and the Mustang would stall. Too fast and he would not be able to land safely on the short emergency field. He tightened his harness, pulled his chin strap secure, and steadied the aircraft. The P-47 pilots escorting him monitored his altitude and position, calling out headings and distance to the field. They remained above him as guardians watching the sky for any stray enemy fighters and ready to radio for emergency ground crew. Howard descended through 5,000 feet. The emergency strip came into view more clearly now. It was a small forward base, likely a temporary fighter field established after recent Allied gains in Belgium. It had one narrow runway, a few tents, one small tower shack, and a cluster of fuel drums arranged beside a service truck. It was not a place built for precision landings, especially not dead-stick landings in a high-speed Mustang. Yet it was Howard's only chance. Behind him, the wounded B-17 continued losing altitude more rapidly than before. It would never reach England. Its remaining engines were overheating. The plane's silhouette wavered in the cold air as it limped toward Belgium. Howard passed through 4,000 feet. His glide slope still looked barely acceptable. He adjusted the trim, gently nosed down slightly to maintain his speed. His descent rate increased, but his forward distance increased as well. Everything depended on minute corrections. 300 feet too low and he would strike trees or farmland. 300 feet too high and he would overshoot. Precision without power was a delicate and unforgiving balance. The earth below became more detailed. He saw frozen fields lined with fences and hedgerows, small houses, dots of snow across the trees. He imagined the people living down there unaware that two aircraft, both fighting for their final moments, were descending overhead. At 3,000 feet, he extended the landing gear. The maneuver increased drag, steepening his descent, but he timed it well enough to compensate by angling slightly downward to hold speed. The wheels locked with a heavy click he felt through the seat. Far ahead, the runway stretched like a thin black strip, cutting through patches of light snow. Howard kept his eyes fixed on it as he slid through 2,500 feet, then 2,000. The P-47s stayed close now, escorting him from both sides, but giving him space for the descent. He passed 1,500 feet. The glide path looked good. The Mustang was heavy but steady. He felt a rare surge of relief, but forced it down. The landing was still the most dangerous part. A dead-engine landing meant no go-around, no second attempt. Fail once, and the aircraft would tear apart on impact. He lowered the flaps slightly to bleed extra speed, keeping the Mustang on the ideal approach angle. The runway grew larger. He was almost there. At 1,000 feet, he crossed the edge of the airfield, flying over ground crew, who scrambled out of tents and shelters, pointing upward at the silent Mustang. They could see the propeller was not moving. They understood instantly what kind of landing this would be. 900 feet, 800, 7. Howard reached the runway threshold at roughly 70 feet. He pulled back gently on the stick, flaring the aircraft. The main landing gear touched first with a heavy thump. The Mustang bounced slightly, but he held it steady. The tail came down, and the aircraft rolled straight along the center line. Without engine power, his braking options were limited, but the snow dampened his speed. The Mustang slowed finally to a long scraping halt near the end of the field. Silence returned. Howard exhaled and lifted his goggles. Ground crew rushed toward him, shouting orders, pulling chocks, sliding ladders, and pointing with disbelief at his fuel gauges, which were bone dry. They saw the jammed guns, the frozen belts, the ammunition counter, still showing 175 unused rounds in the one gun that had stopped firing. His aircraft had been seconds away from falling out of the sky, and yet somehow he had made it down intact. Someone handed him a blanket. Someone else shouted for a truck to take him to operations. Howard shook his head, tried to find his voice, and finally stepped down from the cockpit. He watched the wounded B-17 in the distance descending toward a different emergency strip. It barely made it in time crash landing, but the crew survived. All 10 men, all brought home by a fighter pilot with no bull, its no fuel, and nothing left but determination. When Howard stepped onto the frozen Belgian airfield, the battle around Aschersleben was finally behind him, but the weight of what had happened still clung to him like frost on his flight jacket. His Mustang sat silent behind him, its propeller frozen in place, its guns jammed, and its tanks as empty as a dry well. The ground crew who examined the aircraft shook their heads in disbelief. 3 of his 4 machine guns were locked solid. The remaining gun, which still held 175 rounds, had frozen or jammed during the fight, leaving him completely unarmed for the last half of the battle. His fuel tanks were drained so completely that the mechanics could not draw even a cup of fuel from them. The men stared at the silent aircraft and then at the pilot who had somehow brought it down safely. While Howard answered questions from the airfield officers, the sky above remained clear. The P-47 Thunderbolts that had scared off the German fighters continued circling briefly until they confirmed their sector was safe. Then they peeled off one by one toward their own forward bases. Howard was offered hot tea and a ride to the communications tent, where he reported the sequence of events with the calmness of a man who had not yet had time to understand the scale of what he survived. Meanwhile, the B-17 formation continued limping home. The damaged bomber that Howard had protected during the last brutal moments of the fight lost altitude steadily as its two remaining engines strained. The crew inside fought their own battle just to keep the aircraft level. They had already dumped ammunition, extra gear, and everything they could remove. When they finally reached the emergency bomber field in Belgium, they executed a hard-belly landing that tore pieces from the aircraft but spared the men inside. All 10 members of the crew survived. It was only hours later that the full picture of Howard's actions began to spread. When the surviving B-17 crews made it back to their bases in England, one squadron at a time, the story passed by word of mouth from debriefing rooms to officers' tents. 16 different bomber pilots independently reported the same thing. A single P-51 Mustang had stayed with them for more than 30 minutes while they were deep in Germany fighting off wave after wave of enemy fighters. Many of the bomber crews believed he had shot down 6 German aircraft. Others insisted they saw 4 fall under his attacks. The numbers varied because the chaos of battle created illusions. Smoke trails twisted through the air at strange angles. Enemy aircraft vanished into clouds. Some pilots bailed out while others spun out of sight. In the fog of war, it was difficult to be exact, but every witness agreed on one fact. One fighter pilot had saved the entire bomber group from destruction. In his quiet corner of the Belgian field, Howard had no idea that the story was spreading across England, Germany, and soon the world. He simply waited for a transport to take him back to RAF Boxted, where his own squadron was based. When the jeep finally arrived, he rode silently through the muddy roads of Belgium, passing Allied convoys, tanks, fuel trucks, and marching infantry. The winter sky above him was grey and cold, but after what he had seen only hours earlier, it felt peaceful, almost gentle. He arrived at Boxted later that day. When he entered the operations room, pilots and officers looked up at him with shock. They had already heard fragments of the story, but no one could quite believe it until they saw him walk through the door, still wearing the same oxygen-streaked mask and frost-coated flight suit. His commanding officers pulled him aside, immediately demanding his account. Howard answered, plainly describing how he had battled the first wave of enemy fighters, how his guns had jammed, how he continued to bluff and maneuver until his fuel was nearly gone. He explained how he had glided for miles before finding the emergency field. There was no drama in his voice, no pride, only the quiet tone of a pilot who had done what needed to be done. But outside those walls word spread fast. By the next morning, Stars and Stripes, correspondent Andy Rooney had arrived eager to interview Howard. Rooney listened to every detail, then interviewed several bomber crews who had witnessed the fight. His article soon called Howard's stand the greatest fighter pilot action he had ever heard of. The story leapt from base to base across Europe, then across the Atlantic, then into the newspapers of nearly every Allied nation. The Saturday Evening Post ran a feature calling Howard a one-man air force. Popular Science described the physics and precision of high-speed air combat, using Howard's fight as its centerpiece. True magazine dubbed him the Mustang Whip. While the world debated how many German fighters he had destroyed, official U.S. Army Air Force's records credited him with 3 confirmed kills on January 11th, 2 BF-110s from the early engagement and 1 FW-190 during the main battle, plus probable kills on 2 more. Damage inflicted on additional fighters went uncounted because verification was impossible. But the statistics were never the core of the story. The truth lay in the fact that Howard had protected 300 men without bullets, without fuel, and without a wingman. He had faced 30 enemy fighters alone and held them back long enough for the bombers to complete their mission and escape. When the mission reports reached High Command Brigadier General Harold Bowman immediately filed a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. The request moved swiftly through channels because every witness offered identical support. Even the German pilots who later read the accounts acknowledged the rarity of a single fighter holding off so many attackers for so long. Months later, on June 5, 1944, Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz presented Major James Howard with the Medal of Honor at a ceremony in England, attended by pilots, officers, and crews from every group involved in the mission. Howard stood at attention as the citation was read aloud, noting his conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty, his single-handed defense against more than 30 enemy fighters, and his refusal to leave the bomber formation even when out of ammunition and nearly out of fuel. It praised his fearless determination and credited him with saving countless lives. After the war, Howard continued to fly, rising to the rank of colonel and later brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve. He commanded bomb wings, directed airports, advised military planners, and eventually wrote his autobiography Roar of the Tiger in 1991. He passed away on March 18, 1995, at the age of 81, and was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. Yet long before that final chapter, the men he saved had already ensured that his legacy would endure. They remembered the lone Mustang that appeared whenever danger closed in. They remembered how he maneuvered through the sky without fear. They remembered how he fought even when his guns were empty and his engine dying. They remembered a pilot who refused to surrender and by doing so made sure 300 men returned home alive. In the days that followed the battle, nothing seemed outwardly extraordinary about Major James Howard. He moved through the halls of RAF boxed with the same calm steps and the same quiet focus he had carried since the day he joined the squadron. But around him the atmosphere had changed. Men who had flown dozens of missions without flinching now paused to shake his hand. Mechanics stopped him on the runway to look him in the eyes and thank him for keeping the bombers alive. Commanders debated the details of the mission in their offices, trying to piece together how one Mustang with jammed guns and no fuel had kept an entire German fighter wing at bay for half an hour. The truth was both simple and nearly unbelievable. Howard had refused to abandon the bombers, even when logic said to turn back, even when his ammunition counter showed nothing left, even when his fuel tanks ran dry, he had stayed. And because he stayed, every B-17 of the 401st Bomb Group returned from that mission. In the bomber, barracks crews replayed the day again and again. Some remembered seeing the Mustang dropping into a dive to break up an attack. Others recalled watching the German fighters scatter each time the lone P-51 charged at them. A few spoke of the moment Howard's engine died when they saw the propeller freeze, and yet saw the Mustang continue to maneuver as if defying the laws of flight itself. To the bomber crews, his presence had been more than a tactical advantage. It had been hope. The story spread far beyond the airfields. Newspapers picked up the accounts of a one-man air force fighting above Germany. Commentators marveled at the courage required to face 30 enemy fighters alone, but Howard himself remained quiet. He did not boast. He did not dramatize. During his formal debriefing, he described the events with practical clarity, explaining which German fighters had attacked, from which angles, how he had maneuvered to break up their formations, and how his fuel had finally failed. He did not exaggerate his success, nor conceal the moments when he feared the bombers might fall. In that honesty lay the true measure of his character. His Medal of Honor ceremony took place on June 5, 1944, the day before Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz stood before him in the presence of officers, bomber crews, and pilots from across the European theater. The words of the citation echoed across the airfield, noting his conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty, his single-handed defense against more than 30 enemy fighters, and his refusal to leave the bomber formation even when out of ammunition and nearly out of fuel. It recognized that he had continued to fight long after logic said he should withdraw, and credited him with saving countless American airmen. For many who attended the ceremony, it was a rare moment of light amid a war that had swallowed so much. But for Howard, the honor represented something simpler. It meant that the men he fought to protect had survived, and that was enough. He continued flying missions after receiving the Medal of Honor, leading formations, maintaining discipline, and mentoring younger pilots, who now looked at him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Through the remainder of 1944, he flew escort again, and again guiding bombers into enemy skies and home again. Each time he approached combat, he did so with the caution of experience and the steady courage that defined him. His pilots trusted him not because of the medal he wore, but because of the man behind it. When the war finally ended, Howard transitioned into peacetime service. He rose to the rank of colonel and then brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve. He later managed airports, advised on aviation policy, served in leadership positions, and maintained the disciplined calm that had carried him through a life of flight. Decades later, in 1991, he wrote his autobiography Roar of the Tiger, recounting his experiences in both the Flying Tigers and the European theatre. Readers found in his writing the same clarity and humility that had marked his service. He spoke not of accolades but of responsibility and of the men he had fought beside. On March 18, 1995, James Howard passed away at the age of 81. His remains were laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery among thousands of others who had served their nation. His grave, marked with quiet dignity, reflected the man he had been. Yet long before that day, his legacy had already been secured not in medals or headlines, but in the memories of the men whose lives he had saved. Many of the bomber crewmen lived into old age, raising families, building careers, sharing stories with grandchildren. And in those stories, they often returned to the same image, a lone Mustang cutting through enemy skies above Germany, refusing to leave them even when his guns jammed and his fuel ran dry. They remembered watching German fighters swarm toward them, only to break away each time the Mustang charged. They remembered believing they were about to die, then watching Howard dive past their windows, turning fear into hope. History is shaped by battles and strategies and leaders, but sometimes it is shaped by the courage of a single individual who stands firm when no one else can. On January 11, 1944, that individual was Major James Howard. He faced overwhelming odds alone. He fought without ammunition and then without fuel. He shielded 300 airmen at the cost of nearly everything he had. For 30 unbroken minutes, he stood between life and death for an entire bomber group. And because of that courage, they lived through the mission and returned home. Some stories fade with time, but this one endures because it reminds us that heroism is not always found in numbers. Sometimes it lives in the actions of one pilot in one Mustang above a winter battlefield, refusing to quit. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.